We are here with Pete, and we're now going to have a little look at the more serious propaganda used in the Soviet Union. Now, Pete, when you look up the history of censorship and propaganda, particularly in the Soviet Union, it was designed to stir up a class conflict. And I guess at this point, Australia needs to decide, what kind of nation we're going to stand for. What sort of future we're trying to build. Do we want to be a prosperous democracy or a safe and suffocated authoritarian regime? Because propaganda, it leads to civil conflict, and so does censorship because it stops people from working out their differences. Do you have extensive political experience? Do you think that our politicians can have it both ways? Can we have a democracy in the Western sense and be micromanaged by all these safety things, or are we going to have to pick one way or the other going forward?
Interesting question. I think we are getting to a crossroads. Certainly, couching everything in the technocratic terms of we're doing this for your own good because it's in the interest of your own safety, in the interest of your own health, the interests of your own well-being. As innocuous as all that sounds on the surface, can ultimately lead to a really dangerous position of basically dispossessing and disenfranchising people and undermining, the very democratic core of our society. So yeah, I mean, when we hear statements like you've played from the e-commissioner or health bureaucrats, et cetera, it starts to bring us closer to a point of decision. When do things change in society? Let's ask ourselves, right? They change when there are points of crisis and points of a burning platform, if you will. I'm not sure that Australians have actually reached that point yet. So that will be interesting to monitor is when these things become truly intolerable for the public. What's that tipping point at which they say that's enough? We saw signs of it during the COVID situation, but unfortunately, that was kind of hijacked by a few folks who were out there. So yeah, I'm interested to know when the community will basically say, look, that's the line in the sand. There are these fundamental freedoms that we're actually very concerned about. We're willing to do something more active about it, if you will, as opposed to being, well, frankly, a little perhaps more than tolerant of these encroachments on our liberties.
Well, the last time we spoke, you said that in a world where there is no objective truth, lies can easily stand. And I believe that's the primary concern that people have, particularly libertarians, when the government says it's the sole source of truth. Well, what kind of truth? And the biggest joke at the moment is that the government is the biggest source of misinformation and disinformation in history. And I think that's definitely true of some regimes. But I want to talk about Russia, and I want to talk about its leader, Vladimir Putin. When it comes to manipulating Western democracies, Russia is a world leader, and yet the conservative right, or at least a sizable portion of the conservative right, is starting to look toward Putin as a sort of, shall we say, a spiritual leader. Think the naked shirt one where he's on the horse wandering around, defending freedom or whatever it was. They see him as preferable to the woke idiots festering in our parliament. Now, firstly, Pete, can you understand or see why perhaps people who like conservative values and freedom might drift toward Putin? Because when they watched him interviewed by Tucker Carlson, they made comments about how he was so much better than Biden and Sunak and Albanese just because he could calmly roll off a history lesson, dubious as it was. It's almost like that's a form of propaganda in itself.
Yeah. Look, we're in a weird situation where those who are anti-woke are looking for someone that they can identify with someone who they see as a leader of anti-woke views and positions. And therefore, you can kind of see the logic of how some folks who are anti-woke are moving towards Putin and towards Trump and towards others who are so unconventional in their leadership style and in the content of what they have to say. But look, I think it's a fundamentally strategic error on their part, because when you start to peel the layers of the onion back on Putin, you find that he actually represents aspects that are so contrary to the values that most people who are anti-woke hold, whether it's freedom of the individual, whether it's even family values. I mean, Russia is not noted as a place that's actually doing a lot in terms of maintaining family values. It's got awful problems in terms of its own social fabric with regard to alcoholism and drug abuse and family breakdown, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of get that there's a vacuum in the leadership landscape with regard to people who are anti-woke and reasonable, right? And therefore, the anti-woke folks look for anything, and they get to Putin by default, you know. But you know, that's our obligation as people who purport to individual liberty. Is, you know, we have to think a little bit harder about what it is that we're affiliating ourselves with.
Well, all we hear about Putin is, oh, well, he's pro-conservative values, he's pro-family, he's anti-LGBT and trans stuff, but you never hear the other side of what Putin's up to, which is that he murders journalists, he rigs elections, he tortures his political opponents, he stalks foreign citizens, he controls what the public reads and what they say, and he is basically an old-school brute and a tyrant who considers himself somewhere between a czar and a dictator. But you don't see that put out very often. In fact, Russia's been doing a great job of presenting Putin as the reasonable leader on a world stage full of people like Biden who can't find the stage, and Sunak, who has done absolutely nothing to take control of a country that is steadily falling into chaos. Now, my point is always, if you can't find a leader you like, try and embody that leader. That's what we should be doing instead of looking toward best guesses. But tell us about Putin. What sort of man is he? Where did he come from? Is he really a spiritual guide for conservatives, or has he got a darker past that people need to be looking at when it comes to what he's about?
There's the obvious things in his biography, like having been a KGB agent and trained in KGB tactics. There's the fact that he now openly talks about an imperial destiny for Russia, e.g. that he has said that he's doing the work of Peter the Great in terms of enlarging the size of the Russian empire well beyond Ukraine into places like Poland, et cetera, et cetera. So those are those biographical aspects. There's another way to look at it, and that's psychologically. You know, there's a lot of profiling work done around the world by people who are certainly more qualified than me in terms of PSYOP and strategic communication, et cetera. And one of the theories that's been forward is actually kind of interesting, and that is that I'm the last person to go for armchair psychology, but here I am basically quoting people who are professional profilers. They talk about Putin as having antisocial personality disorder, and when you look at others who have antisocial personality disorder, they're often very much mafia leaders. So a lot of empirical work has been done, for example, in the United States with incarcerated mafia bosses. And sure enough, somewhere upwards of 80% of them have antisocial personality disorder. What does that mean? It means you're extremely loyal to your tiny little tribe, your little mafia, and you basically have no moral qualms around other people. And if you think about Putin's track record, that kind of makes a lot of sense. You know, he's established this kind of coterie of oligarchs who basically do his bidding and all benefit from him economically. But his regard for human life outside that small circle is non-existent, essentially. He's quite happy to basically trade in human life with the instances that you mentioned, or in the case of Ukraine, upwards of 20,000 civilian dead in 2 years, daily bombings of people's flats. In the year 2024, that's 100 missiles, drones, and guided bombs per day. 100 ballistic missiles per day. That's massive in its scale. So I'm not sure how, just to satisfy ourselves on an anti-woke basis, we could possibly condone that kind of brutality, that kind of anti-humanity, which perhaps is at the center of liberalism, isn't it? That respect for humanity.
Well, certainly the size of his table denotes that he might be a little bit antisocial when he gets the people sitting 100 miles away from him. But you're totally right that we never really talk about what Putin gets up to. And I think that is part of the reason why libertarians who say they are anti-interventionist can then go and can support Russia's bid to take over countries that don't want to be part of Russia anymore, it would seem like a contradiction, but we don't talk about it, so it doesn't come into context. But has Putin actually committed crimes himself that we know about, particularly in his role of the KGB, or is there no information really available and our best guess is just assumptions because of the way Russia protects itself?
Probably the latter, but one thing we do know for certain is that he is now officially charged with war crime by international crime agencies, particularly in the context of the kidnap of Ukrainian children. So it's estimated that since the beginning of the war, thousands of Ukrainian children have basically been removed from their parents, taken into Russia, and they've been placed essentially into indoctrination camps, where they're effectively being rewired with regard to their national allegiances, their cultural allegiances, their languages, their love of their own parents. So I don't know. I mean, when people talk about, for example, family values and something that Putin allegedly represents family values, and therefore we should somehow be affiliated with him. I didn't know that separating families and basically removing kids from their parents, I didn't actually know that counted as a family value.
Well, if we're going to be manipulated by somebody, and we are being manipulated by Putin, you have to ask, what does Putin want for Russia? Because that's his main objective. And then the question also becomes, are Russia's long-term goals as a nation the same as Putin's, or is the future of Russia difficult to predict? Because beyond the influence of Putin, who could be next? When you have a regime that's run by a single entity rather than a group, I don't know. What do you think? Is it tied to Putin's thing, or do you think that Russia might have a confusing future that we can't predict?
Interesting. There's two large factors at play. One is the power structure of the Russian Federation, and I think the best parallel for that is a word I used before, a mafia. It's all organized around mafia lines of, a godfather in Putin and capos in the form of the oligarchs. So that's one factor to consider. The other factor to consider is, and here, I don't put all the blame, if you will, on Putin alone. I think in the same way that individuals suffer from mental illnesses and psychological problems, cultures can too. And for mine, given that 80 to 90% of Russians support the invasion of Ukraine, support the liquidation of so-called Nazis in Ukraine, if ever there was a nonsense, says something about Russia's political culture, and is it diseased in its own right? And just as Nazi Germany needed to be defeated to actually look at its own culture, understand what was working and not working in its own culture, it's kind of sad to say Russia may need a defeat in this war against Ukraine to reflect on its own future. At the moment, there's no prospect of a trajectory towards democracy in Russia. It may need some form of national humiliation and catharsis to go forward. And in some ways, that might be what ultimately guarantees security and prosperity, is a Russia that's reformed in a new image, perhaps a more humble one.